And so the point of Genesis 1 to 2 is to show us that God created everything for his purpose. And we could be confident that God created everything, but we won't know exactly how God created everything because he does not reveal that to us. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, verse 1. And then there's a bunch of events that happen after verse 1 that's not recorded. This is where they say the fall of Satan happened. This is where the plants and there's original plants and animals that got decayed and destroyed. And so what they say is that verse 2 now is as if it flashes forward to after the first creation, and God is now recreating what he created in verse 1 after all the fall of Satan and destruction and all these things. Because why did they say that? Look at verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over. So there is an earth already, but it's just a destroyed version without form and void. So they will say in the gap theory, all of the fossils, all of the dead plants and animals, all those millions or billions of years of stuff happened in that period between verse 1 and 2. That's the gap theory. The gap theory then, they interpret the days of creation as literal starting from verse 2. So they do believe in a literal 6-day creation. They just say there's a lot of things that happen between day 1 and the original creation that is not recorded. And in verse 2, God is recreating over his original creation. He's doing almost like a second time after all this destruction and sin and Satan and stuff happened. And so they argued that the fall in Genesis 3 doesn't introduce sin. What it does is introduces sin into this creation. Sin already existed in the heavenly realm amongst Satan and demons in the gap. Does that make sense, the argument? So that's their argument. Starting at verse 3, everything should be read literally, but between verses 1 and 2, there are millions and millions of years where death and destruction of animals and plants and then the angels and the demons, all that stuff happened during that time. That's why the earth is formless and void by the time you get to verse 2. Second is flood. This is young earth theory. Because what they're trying to argue is, here's a problem both people face. How do you reconcile the scientific information we do know now with the seemingly description, right? Because it doesn't fit. So here's the flood theory. If you guys remember, the flood theory says that all of the fossils, all of the things that we see today didn't happen over billions of years. It didn't happen in the gap. It happened through the flood. So they will argue even this idea of the layers took thousands, millions of years, that's a modern day conception. It's all of that was created through the flood was this disruptive event on earth that created all these fossils and created all these layers of sedimentary thing because it was supernaturally speeding up a process. So they would argue, yes, naturally speaking, this erosion pattern will take millions of years, but if it's a supernatural flood event, it doesn't take millions of years if it's that disruptive. So it appears like it took millions of years for all these fossils things, but it just happened through one big event, the flood. Let's go to ideal time, which is also young earth. This goes to the idea of when God created everything, he created it in its mature state. And that is true. If you look at the text, he didn't create baby Adam and then baby Eve. He didn't create small doggies, right? He didn't create seeds. They're all mature. So their argument is that, yes, the earth appears to be millions and billions of years old, but it doesn't mean it took millions and billions of years old for God to create an earth that's millions and billions of years old. Just like it didn't take 30 years to make Adam to look like a 30-year-old, it didn't take, I don't even know the life of a plant, 5 years for a plant to be mature. It didn't take 10 years for a puppy to become a dog. He did it instantaneously. And so when God created the instantaneous earth, it was a mature earth that appears to be millions of billions of years old. So we are observing correctly, it looks like a billions of years old because it's an old earth, but it doesn't mean it took that long to become old. Age day, this is for old earth. It's day doesn't always mean 24-hour day. So clearly day just means it could be however long period. So they argue the days in the Genesis account are millions of years old or whatever it is, right? That's what it means there. Finally, the pictorial day, so they believe it's a historical narrative, yet they still affirm the historical narrative points to an old earth idea. So what is it? They argue that Genesis 1 is just pictures or symbols that provide structure for a theological purpose of creation that's going to be set forth in the rest of the Bible. So for example, this argument points that God is creating his temple in Genesis 1. That's the whole point. Because if you look at the structures of the days, sky, land, and earth, that follows later on when you look at the tabernacle, because the tabernacle goes back to those elements. It uses the Eden and the temple. And so the idea of this is saying that when God is creating the earth, he's using a description of a picture of him as if he's creating the temple to make the point that this earth is our temple, which he later will show with physical pictures of the tabernacle and temple. So for example, Exodus 39-40 describes the tabernacle as to be constructed in 7 days. Why do you think they think 7 days? To mimic what? 7-day creation. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 38 talks about the temple to be constructed in 7 years. Why do you think they did 7 years? They're looking back at the creation account of 7-day creation. This is not meant to be read literally, this is what happened. This is meant to be seen as a picture that gets repeated in history by the Jews as the basis for their tabernacle and temple. So that would be the pictorial date. This is a picture, not to be read as that. The problem for young earth people I would bring up. Did Moses intend Genesis 1-2 to be a scientific document? The intention of the author really matters here. Is that the way you're supposed to read the text? Just like we wouldn't read Psalms the way we would read the gospel accounts, you don't read it the same way. So is that the way Moses intended? Is this meant to be a historical narrative in the same way that the gospel accounts are a historical narrative, or Judges is a historical narrative? That's one thing I would bring up. If it is supposed to be a historical narrative, then why does Moses not include anything else about Europe or Asia's history or anything else, right? It's only Jewish history that seems to be. Why? Because he's writing to a certain audience. So clearly, Moses is putting in only things that are relevant to his audience, and he's not including everything that actually happened. All right, old earth. Here's the biggest problem I see with the old earth problem. Evolution requires death. Death does not exist until sin is introduced in Genesis 3. How do you have millions of years of death before sin? So how can animals and plants die if that didn't happen until Genesis 3? How can they have died in Genesis 1-2 if you're saying evolution is the way things are created? Because evolution by definition requires death. Now some of them will say, well, the gap theory, right? Some of them will say death was introduced already, but the death that is introduced is human death. But at the end of the day, there's still a problem at the end, because if you look at Romans, Paul writes in the language that death entered into all of creation through Adam, not just human death. It seems to indicate all of creation has experienced death from Adam. That's why Jesus is the new Adam who restores, where all life comes into it. How can you explain a supernatural event, namely creation, through a scientific method? One of the problems of old earth is that they're looking at supernatural events through a scientific lens. My question is, are you supposed to be looking at supernatural events through a scientific lens? Is there supposed to be a scientific explanation to the parting of the Red Sea? Is there supposed to be a scientific explanation to how Jesus fed 5,000, 20,000 people? We would all agree creation is a miraculous supernatural event. Are you supposed to be looking at that with the scientific lens at all? Does it even need to be explained scientifically? This goes with our evidence that it took millions of years for plants. Does that even need to be explained? And at what point is it a miracle? Is a miracle supposed to remain a miracle, or are we supposed to explain away every miracle scientifically? So here's where I see the big debate. People are speaking over each other. Because what young earth people tend to do is they're trying to attribute all of their science based on what? A miracle. The flood, typically, right? They say, all the science stuff we see today, you could explain away with the miracle. And old earth, they're trying to explain a miracle away with what? Science. So they're both coming from different foundations. And here's the problem. Are you supposed to even marry science and miracles to begin with? So you're like, what do you think? I think both sides are wrong. And I think both sides are probably right. I just don't know where until we get there. Creation actually points to whom? Jesus, living on this earth, recreating our bodies, recreating the animal, recreating our relationships, recreating all things so that we can live in perfect harmony with one another and King Jesus the way Adam and Eve were supposed to do before sin entered into the world. And that's the actual narrative of the Bible that is true without error, but it doesn't tell us exactly the process of how God created all these things. And so the point of Genesis 1-2 is to show us that God created everything for his purpose. And we could be confident that God created everything, but we won't know exactly how God created everything because he does not reveal that to us. And what I always say is all truth is God's truth. You don't have to be afraid of science, psychology, anthropology, whatever they find, all truth is God's truth. Everything that is actually true in those fields will be consistent with what we know about God. So you don't ignore that and say, well, they're all wrong because I only believe in the Bible. No, you believe in the Bible as sufficient, but it's also the lens by which we understand all truth outside of the Bible. Like things scientists say can be true, and if it is true, it is God's truth. It's not even their theory. And so God's truth in the science world or anthropology world, the sociology world or psychology world, it is all consistent with Scripture. We just don't know how to fit it yet, but it is in some way.